Joseph Smith, look at his life. Golden plates, magical underwear, the amount of women he slept with. Only men can own their own planet. Who is Paul? Totally different from Joseph Smith.
Who's reliable? And the bottom line for me is their writings were accepted as legitimate, historically reliable.
Hey guys, so recently a couple of preachers, Cliffe and Stuart, responded to a question involving Joseph Smith and Latter-day Saints. It seemed to me when I watched the video that there weren't actually any Latter-day Saints there to weigh in on what was being said, so I thought I'd respond to them and kind of react to their video and throw in my 2 cents. I've seen a couple of videos from these guys. I generally like them. I think that they have good intentions. It seems like they want to bring people closer to Christ, which is great, and anything that brings people closer to Christ, I'm like all for, though we may disagree on maybe some of the minutia of how to do that. So hopefully this feedback will kind of help them or others in the future when similar topics arise. Let's do it.
Like, Paul wrote a lot of the books of the Bible and stuff, and like, we trust him and we trust his word. Like, why do we trust him and not, like, I don't know, I'm thinking of like Joseph Smith, who started with Mormonism or whatever, and he said he had a revelation from God and like started a book and all this stuff. So why do we trust Paul but we don't trust
The reason that I trust Paul to give me accurate information is because the eyewitness community who knew Christ accepted his writings as legitimate. See, so much for me comes back to who's reliable. And the bottom line for me is the evidence, historical in nature, of the way he lived, taught, died, and rose from the dead is Jesus is reliable. Now, the way I find out about Jesus is from the eyewitnesses who saw him, who heard him. They wrote what they saw and they heard. Their writings were accepted as legitimate, historically reliable.
Yeah, I agree with what Cliffe is saying here, and I appreciate that he's not, bashing on Latter-day Saints at this point. I agree. When we're trying to decide what or who to believe, we should look at the evidence. We should look at the eyewitnesses, if there are eyewitnesses, and we have to make a judgment call about whether or not they are reliable. I also think that different people can look at the same evidence and come to different conclusions. For example, with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we can't prove that that happened. If Christ wanted it to be provable, it'd be provable. But instead, we're left with what the witnesses experienced, and we have to decide whether or not to believe them. And I think the same thing applies to Joseph Smith and his prophetic calling and the golden plates. I can't prove that the golden plates existed, but what we do have are the witnesses. We have 11 official witnesses in the beginning of the Book of Mormon. You can read their testimonies, the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses, who testified that they saw the golden plates. Now, we can cast those witnesses off as liars, or maybe they were hypnotized, or, whatever. But I think we should look at the evidence. I don't think the evidence supports those conclusions. And for me personally, I've studied their statements and their lives quite seriously, and I find them quite convincing. I do also think, though, that when it comes to these things that you have to rely on faith for, the resurrection of Christ, the Book of Mormon, I do think it's important to pay attention to witness testimony and look at the evidence. At the same time, maybe some of these things aren't provable because God wants us to turn to him for our testimony. So I think that a spiritual witness of the truthfulness of these things should not be understated when it comes to matters of faith. I believe that Jesus Christ was resurrected. I also believe that Joseph Smith had golden plates, and I believe the witnesses when they say that they saw them and they handled them and that an angel presented them to them. At the same time, my spiritual witness is extremely important to me as well. I could talk about this for another hour, but for the sake of time, let's keep going.
Stuart, what about you? Why do you?
Well, the historicity of it too. Joseph Smith, look at his life and look at, for example, the history of what happened in upstate New York, where a lot of Mormonism got off the ground. Look at the plates created, these golden plates, the magical underwear. I mean, I could have created plates in my garage, right? Spray painted them.
Okay, so this is where Stuart starts to lose me. The magical underwear thing. We don't consider our temple garments, that's what he's referring to be magical. This is just kind of disparaging jargon that has been thrown at Latter-day Saints for a really long time. So on the one hand, it makes me question the value. Sorry, I had an itchy nose. On the one hand, it makes me question the value of what Stuart is going to be telling us, and it makes me question also what his sources are and the reliability of what he's going to tell us. Because the fact that he's calling our sacred clothing magical underwear tells me that he's probably not talking to Latter-day Saints about what they actually believe about temple garments. It's also unfortunate because religions around the world have clothing that they consider to be sacred for various reasons. Even Paul, as an ancient Jew, would have worn clothing that he considered to be sacred. So it's unfortunate that these guys, or at least this one guy, Stuart, is disparaging something that personally brings me closer to Christ. Temple garments are reminders to Latter-day Saints of the covenants that they have made in temples. For example, in temples, Latter-day Saints covenant to follow the gospel of Jesus Christ. Men and women who are married promise or covenant to be faithful to each other. Our garments are reminders to us of those covenants that we've made. My garments make me a better person. They help me to remember to follow more closely Jesus Christ. They're not magical. And it's unfortunate then to see kind of something that brings me closer to Christ, to see it disparaged like this, made a joke of. I don't think that that's particularly cool. Stuart also mentions creating fake plates, spray painting fake plates in his garage. Faking plates in 1820, upstate New York, would have been very different from faking plates in 2024. Joseph Smith didn't have spray paint, and I don't think that there's evidence to suggest that Joseph Smith had either the skills or the materials to fake plates. There aren't any reports that I'm aware of from anybody else in the surrounding community, from friends or enemies, saying, oh yeah, Joseph Smith came over and he did this metallurgy job for me, or whatever. There's no indication that he had the ability to do this. Even if we entertain the idea that he did, how did he do that without his family finding out? He had a large family, they had a small home, it would have taken some time to create plates, probably wouldn't have been a quiet process, and nobody walked in on Joseph, creating the plate. When did he do this without being noticed? And I guess you can say, well, maybe his whole family was in on it. And if you go that route, well, I hope that would be supported by evidence as well. But I haven't seen that. His family seems to very sincerely believe in him and believe in his prophetic call and believe that the golden plates were real. So the further you go down this conspiratorial rabbit hole that, oh, maybe his family was in on it, maybe, this and that, the further you go down that route without evidence, the less likely it is to be true. So I think you have to be careful with the implications of what you're suggesting happened here. Because if we really care about eyewitness testimony and the evidence and whatnot, as has been stated, well, where's the evidence for these claims that are being made? It bothers me.
Archaeologically speaking, those sites in upstate New York are fantasy. Many of them haven't even existed.
Okay, so that was a very quick clip. I'm a little bit confused, though. I think he's talking about Book of Mormon sites. This wouldn't be a problem for most Latter-day Saints, because most Latter-day Saints don't believe that the story of the Book of Mormon, at least 99% of it, we don't believe it occurred in New York. That was where the plates were buried at the end of the story. You're not going to find places like Zarahemla or the land of Nephi or whatever. You're not going to find those places in New York because they're not there. Most Latter-day Saints believe these events happened in Mesoamerica. There is a subset of Latter-day Saints, the Heartlanders, who believe that the events of the Book of Mormon happened in the United States. They might have a different response to this claim than I do, but as for me, this isn't a problem.
Archaeologically, what you have there in the New Testament, and where Paul is specifically, you have over 84, it's around 84 different facts historically of places that existed just within the book of Acts alone. So you have places like towns like Bethany. Galilee, I believe, was known, but you have Bethesda. These are towns that have historically been shown now to exist. It was only out of the Pauline letters, for example, and the gospel that have shown these towns actually exist. No other ancient document has shown that so many of these different towns actually exist. So archaeologically, the difference is so grand, it's scary. So archaeologically and historical verifiability.
So it's true that a lot of Bible locations have been discovered and archaeologically been proven to be real. There are also a lot of places in the Bible that haven't yet been discovered. But I think it's important to recognize that just because the Sea of Galilee exists, it doesn't prove that Jesus walked on it. Even though we know where some locations are, there's still a large faith factor in there. And to be clear, I do believe that Jesus walked on the Sea of Galilee. When it comes to the Book of Mormon, I think it's important that we separate out Old World archaeology from New World archaeology. As far as Old World archaeology goes, a pretty small portion of the Book of Mormon takes place in the Old World, and researchers have found a very plausible route for Old World events from the Book of Mormon. Lehi leaves Jerusalem and comes down to the Indian Ocean, and things line up remarkably well based on what the Book of Mormon says about that journey. Nahom, the place mentioned in the Book of Mormon, is right where it should be. Researchers have found that site, or at least a site that plausibly fits that description. But New World archaeology is a completely different animal. I think doing a dig in an arid desert location is going to be very, very different from doing a dig in a dense tropical jungle. So I don't think it's quite fair to compare Old World archaeology to New World archaeology. The challenges are different. And on top of that, we don't know where Lehi landed. We don't know where to start looking. We also don't know how much is left to find. There are a lot of challenges associated with Book of Mormon archaeology, though in recent years it's been really interesting to see things like LiDAR laser imaging technology come out. It feels like every 2 weeks now. Okay, that's an exaggeration. But it feels like very often LiDAR imaging is revealing ancient cities that have yet to be explored. It could be that we've already found many of the locations, and we just haven't figured out the identifying connections to the Book of Mormon yet. It's a different animal from Old World archaeology. I acknowledge that there are still questions, but it's really been fascinating to me to see just in recent years the progress that has been made archaeologically and technologically in New World archaeology. I think it's fascinating stuff. Let's roll the next clip.
Next would be, who is Paul? Who is Joseph Smith? The character. Joseph Smith, talk about the amount of women he slept with.
Okay, that wasn't Joseph Smith. That looked like some AI Roman guy with a bunch of Roman women. Interesting B-roll choice. Anyway, the assumption here seems to be that Joseph Smith used polygamy in order to sleep around with women. I don't think that the evidence supports that conclusion. The public loves a good sex scandal, but when we separate rumor from what we actually know about Joseph Smith's polygamy, I don't think it supports a hedonistic motivation. If you want some more information about this, okay, I always have to plug Brian Hale's 3-volume set if you want to look at what we know about Joseph Smith's polygamy. But also Don Bradley, who helped out with those volumes, has some really great recent research that backs up this idea that he wasn't just after sex. So check those things out if you haven't before. The other thing about this topic, the polygamy topic, that is important for me personally is that it's okay to have questions about polygamy. I still have questions about polygamy and plural marriage and Joseph Smith. But for me, it's important to recognize that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, okay? For example, polygamy doesn't explain to me where the Book of Mormon came from. It doesn't explain to me what the witnesses saw when Joseph Smith handed them the plates or when an angel handed them the plates in the case of the 3 witnesses. It doesn't explain to me where the 500 plus pages of the intricate, cohesive, complex text of the Book of Mormon came from. On top of that, I don't belong to the Church of Joseph Smith or Russell M. Nelson or Paul or Elijah or Peter. I belong to the Church of Jesus Christ. He is the guy that I'm seeking to build a relationship with. He's the guy I'm trying to emulate. Imperfectly, but I'm trying. Every other human being involved is flawed. Prophets are flawed. I'm flawed. God chooses to call flawed people because I think flawed people are the only people he has to work with. But ultimately, my goal is to be like Christ and to point other people to Christ as well. And I think that that's what these guys are trying to do as well. Again, I acknowledge the good that they do, though we disagree on maybe how we're representing things when it comes to other religions. But let us continue.
Talk about the sexism that goes on, sadly, in Mormonism today. It's only men can own their own planet. It's definitely not women.
It definitely is women. Okay, I'm going to back up here. I'll give you some context. This is another red flag for me, the whole Mormons get to own their own planet thing. It tells me that, again, he's not talking to Latter-day Saints about these things. Maybe I'm making assumptions. Stuart, please correct me if I'm wrong here. Maybe a Latter-day Saint did say, I'm going to get my own planet one day. But more often than not, this is not coming from Latter-day Saints. He's not talking to Latter-day Saints in order to understand what they believe. This is something that's probably just been regurgitated to him from other mainstream Christians or his pastor growing up or whatever. This is something that we hear about a lot. And it's another disparaging remark that is really a caricature of what we actually believe God has in store for us. Now, we do believe in deification, or the idea that we can, at one point in eternity, become like God. We believe that God wants all of his children to be blessed with all that he has. He wants us to know the things that he knows and do the things that he does. In that sense, owning your own planet is really small potatoes compared to what we actually believe. Now, it's important to point out while we're on this topic that we don't believe that we will replace God at some point, or that we will surpass God, or that we will at some point no longer need God. That is not the purpose here. We just believe that God has great blessings in store for us. We believe that we are joint heirs with Christ. A metaphor that I like is we kind of view God as the oak tree and we are the acorns. We believe that we are the same kind. There is vast distance between us, but we're of the same species, of the same eternal stuff. And we believe that, like any father would, he wants to bless us with everything that he has. Now, when it comes to deification or receiving these blessings, we believe that the only people who qualify are married couples, a man married to a woman. So this idea that women are excluded from exaltation or deification, that is categorically untrue. In fact, the only way you can receive these blessings is if you're a team. You are a married couple, a man and a woman. It's actually interesting that he kind of excludes women from this idea of deification, because I believe that we are the only major religion, at least Christian religion, that I can think of off the top of my head that believes that in addition to a heavenly father, we have a heavenly mother as well. I think that's really significant. We could talk about that a lot, but I'll leave it at that.
What did Paul teach? What was his character? He gave up everything. He was considered a complete joke. He went from the top of the world in Jewish rabbinical studies, right, and leadership, to literally dirt for what he said he encountered with the resurrected Christ. Totally different from Joseph Smith.
I agree that Paul is very different from Joseph Smith. I don't think it is a one-to-one comparison. So I think that's fine. I think that the principle here that Stuart is getting at is that Paul is a trustworthy source because of how much he sacrificed for his testimony of Christ. And in that sense, I do think that Joseph Smith is generally similar. He didn't convert from a position of prominence like he talks about Paul doing. Joseph Smith was, from the beginning of his story, quite literally in the dirt as a young, poorly educated farm boy. But when it comes to sacrifices, he absolutely sacrificed quite a bit. He was tarred and feathered. He was unjustly imprisoned. He was eventually murdered. Look at what happened to him and his followers. Just crack open a history book. I don't think that the fact that someone sacrifices for a cause necessarily proves that the cause is true or that that person is trustworthy. I think there are examples where that isn't the case. And I'm not saying that Stuart is claiming that, but as far as sacrifice goes, it definitely doesn't hurt his case that he is sincere. So when it comes to Joseph Smith, the fact that he never renounced his testimony despite his sacrifices and the persecution he suffered, I think is telling. The fact that no one in his family renounced Joseph as a fraud or threw him under the bus. The fact that the witnesses of the golden plates, even after many of them left the church or had a falling out with Joseph, the fact that the witnesses of the golden plates continue to believe in the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon throughout the rest of their lives, and despite their own persecutions that they suffered, I think all those things are very telling. Now, I do think that Joseph and Paul are similar in the sense that they both had an encounter with God that absolutely changed the course of their lives. And that same encounter, those encounters that they experienced, have changed the lives of millions after them, including mine. You get to decide who to believe. You get to decide who is credible. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. That's between you and God. As for me, I believe in Paul and I believe in Joseph. And I promise you, and I testify to you, that in my life, for me personally, believing in both of them has brought me closer to Christ. Thank you guys for watching. Check out this video while you're here. Have a great day.